Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Werewolf the Apocalypse Earthblood. I played it on the Xbox Series X. It's also available on the Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and Microsoft Windows. So let's start off with the story. You play as a character named Cahal. He is a werewolf, and basically the story is not as important in this game as the message of the game. This is one of those games where the message is more important than the story, or at least the developers thought so they didn't really bother to tell an interesting story. The werewolves are basically trying to save the planet from a big evil corporation, and I honestly, didn't mind the story at first, although it really is more of what should be like a subplot in most games. But then it went full Captain Planet on us, and they're not up against some evil blood-sucking corporation. They went full, no, now we're trying to poison the planet. And I'm like, it really felt like something out of a Captain Planet cartoon, and it was just kind of got ridiculous at that point. But beyond that, I just don't care about the story because really we've seen it before. The way they've told it is uninteresting. They haven't done anything unique or special with the idea. And every event that happens in this game, you know exactly where it's going to go and how it's going to end. On top of that, poor storytelling, anything that is supposed to feel super important and, it just doesn't because it's poorly told. Or another important event that comes to mind happens basically off screen and your character has no reaction to it. So it's just really a generic story that is poorly told, and really it's unfortunate that the cool idea of playing as a werewolf and being a werewolf in this story is completely wasted. And I use Captain Planet because that was always ridiculous. They're like, hey, we sold $200 million worth of crude oil and we could be rich for the rest of our lives, but instead we're gonna poison the planet. And that's what the company does in this game, so it just doesn't really make sense, and it takes just a wacky turn so that they can be like, oh, look at how evil these corporations are, and it got silly. And I want to say this, I'm not sitting there just shitting on this game for having a message. I think that's fine, and I'm totally okay with it. I don't think it's okay when the message overshadows everything else. When the devs are so focused on telling their message that they don't bother to tell a good story, well then why bother creating a piece of entertainment? Make a fucking documentary. There are plenty of video games out there that have had the same message as this game, but it's buried in there. There's a good story that gets you into it, then gets you thinking about what that message is as well, whereas this, it felt like a sledgehammer to the face. Now let's get into the audio, and this is one of the things that doesn't help the story is the voice acting isn't that good. Most of it's pretty bad. I mean, it's not horrible, but it's far from good. The voice actor behind Cahal really doesn't lend any weight to the emotions of this character, and that's true of, most of the characters. Then you've got the overly generic music. I mean, you've got pretty generic metal playing when you're doing action stuff, and then completely ignorable music the rest of the game. I mean, it's serviceable, but it's not like it's something that will stand out and you'll remember it. And as for the sound effects, I think they work well enough. They're good enough sound effects for what's going on. They're not, again, anything that really stands out. Okay, so let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot. This is a third-person stealth and action game with some RPG elements. I mean, another one. So I will say, it's kind of cool and unique that as a werewolf, you can transform into a dog form and a regular werewolf form. The dog form is really poorly named since it's called a lupus, which is also a disease. I don't know why they went with that. But I think that is actually a kind of cool concept. Unfortunately, like everything else in this game, it's just not well executed. While you transform and you sneak about, there are issues with the sneaking. It is serviceable, it works well enough, but you run into weird problems like guards staring at exactly where you need to go, and you can't exactly get them away in the way you need to. The stealth just doesn't work quite as well as it needs to be a full stealth game. It just lacks the depth required. Like, you have a crossbow, but I quite frankly found it completely useless, and so it got to the point where I almost forgot that I had it. it. But then you also have your combat, which is equally boring. Like, they tried to give you depth with your big combat form having two different stances, your quick stance and your heavy stance. And you get special abilities for both stances, so it sounds like there would be depth there, but there's no combo system. All the enemies can die basically the same way. All the fights boil down to essentially the same thing, and it just gets old and uninteresting. There's also not a morality system, but you can choose the direction conversations will go, but that doesn't have any huge effect on the game, really, so it's one of those things where you wonder why it's there. And honestly, 90% of the stealth sections, because the stealth doesn't work well, end up devolving into basically combat sections. Neither element worked well enough. But also, neither element was fully terrible. They were just perfectly mediocre, they were okay, they were there. Also, there is a lock-on feature in the game, and that is trash. It really doesn't work well. I was looking at a big mech suit that I needed to beat, so I locked onto it because I wanted to focus on it, and the game locked onto an enemy across the room behind me. Completely useless. Just useless. That's not okay, that doesn't help me. Let's get into the controls, which I'm gonna say are actually better than this game deserves overall, though I did have some issues. There were a few times where I was trying to change stances when I was a werewolf and it wouldn't let me, but also there were issues with aiming. Aiming the crossbow, which is probably another one of the reasons I didn't use it much, it's shit. It doesn't aim well, that's just a feature. The crossbow in general is not a great feature. Overall, the responsivity of the movement and the button presses, that is really good, and I felt that overall they were well mapped out. So I don't have any massive complaints with the controls, but I will say aiming not so good, and there were a couple times where it didn't quite work the way I wanted. But never truly devastatingly. Now let's get into the graphics, and I'm gonna say Cahal is pretty good looking. Not as much detail as there should be, not quite Xbox Series X level, which I say for a specific reason because when I went to pick up this game, they had two versions. They had the Xbox One / Xbox Series X version and the Xbox Series X only version, which is what I picked up, and there's no reason for it to exist graphically. Because while Cahal has a decent amount of detail put into his outfit, the leather looks pretty real, they have detail in his hair, his skin, etc. Nothing else in this game looks like it should. Everything else in this game looks like it's straight off of an Xbox 360 game. And saying that, I'm probably being a little too generous. We're talking like somewhere between Xbox and Xbox 360. Like, the game wasn't really designed for the 360, but it was released on it. Like, I wish I was joking, but the other characters have minimal detail in them. They're generic. You can't tell that their skin is anything other than an old texture. Like, what it looks like at this point in time is ridiculous. It looks like a 14-year-old game. And I understand, again, not a AAA studio, but I mean, after having played some other indie games, they could do better, they just didn't. It feels like the love wasn't there. And I mean, it's everything. It's the world itself, the lack of textures, the lack of variety. It just isn't that impressive to look at. So to wrap this up, I'm just gonna say that this is one of those games that is, at its best, okay. Like, at its best, it reaches mediocrity, and at its worst, it's bad. But the reality of it is, it never reaches a state where I'm like, hey, this is worth existing. It's not even so bad that I'm like angry about having played it or anything, so it's not even interesting in that element. Just overall, it's a skip because, like I said, at its best, it gets to be okay. Okay, so in the comments down below, what's your top pick for a game that had a good idea that was completely wasted? Like, getting to play as a werewolf. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.